Have you ever wondered why some people shatter when faced with disaster, while others somehow transform their worst moments into their greatest strengths? Why do some people get knocked down by life and stay down, while others rise from the ashes, more powerful than before? The answer might be found in an unlikely connection between a 16th century political philosopher and modern psychology. Imagine losing everything overnight. Your career, your reputation, your freedom, all gone in an instant. That's exactly what happened to Niccolò Machiavelli in 1512. For 14 years, he'd been a rising star in the Florentine government, handling diplomatic missions across Europe and advising the highest levels of leadership. Then, in a sudden political upheaval, the powerful Medici family returned to Florence. The Republic fell, and Machiavelli found himself not just unemployed, but arrested, tortured, and eventually exiled from the city he had dedicated his life to serving. Talk about a fall from grace. One day he's shaping international relations and advising rulers. The next, he's a broken man living in poverty on a small farm outside the city, watching helplessly as his enemies take control. For most people, this would be the end of the story, a tragedy with no redemption in sight. But that's not what happened. Instead, during this painful exile, Machiavelli wrote what would become one of the most influential political works in history, The Prince, a book still studied and debated more than 500 years later. How did he manage this remarkable transformation from disgraced politician to immortal thinker? And what can his story teach us about overcoming our own setbacks? To understand this, we need to fast forward about 450 years to the laboratories of psychologist Martin Seligman. In the 1960s, Seligman was conducting experiments that would revolutionize our understanding of how humans respond to adversity. He discovered what he called learned helplessness, a psychological state where people who have faced repeated failures or situations beyond their control eventually stop trying to change their circumstances, even when new opportunities arise. In his most famous experiments, Seligman found that when dogs were subjected to electric shocks, they couldn't escape. They eventually just lay down and whimpered, accepting their fate. Later, even when the conditions changed and escape became possible, they didn't try. They had learned to be helpless. The same pattern shows up in humans who have experienced persistent failure or trauma. They stop believing that anything they do will make a difference. When we face inescapable shock or failure, Seligman explained, we learn that nothing we do matters. And this lesson, once learned, is so powerful that it generalizes to new situations where control is actually possible. This is exactly what could have happened to Machiavelli. After such a devastating fall from power, being tortured and exiled, watching everything he valued disappear, he could have easily concluded that his life was over, that nothing he could do would ever matter again. Most people would have sunk into depression and obscurity, convinced of their own powerlessness. But here's where the story gets interesting. Machiavelli didn't respond that way at all. In a famous letter to his friend Francesco Vettori, he described his daily routine in exile. When evening comes, I return home and enter my study. At the door, I take off my everyday clothes covered in mud and dirt and put on the garments of court. And for 4 hours I feel no boredom. I forget all my troubles. I do not fear poverty, and I am not terrified by death. During these evening hours, Machiavelli would read ancient texts and write his observations about power, politics, and human nature. Observations that would eventually form The Prince and his other works. Think about that for a moment. Despite losing everything externally, Machiavelli found a way to reclaim his sense of agency and purpose. He refused to accept that his influence was over just because his official position was gone. This is precisely what Seligman would later identify as the opposite of learned helplessness, learned optimism. It's the ability to see setbacks as temporary and specific, rather than permanent and all-encompassing. It's the belief that even when you can't control your circumstances, you can control how you respond to them. Seligman found that people who overcome adversity tend to explain negative events to themselves in 3 specific ways. They see problems as temporary, not permanent. This bad situation will end. Specific, not universal. This affects one area of my life, not everything. And external or circumstantial, not entirely personal. This happened due to various factors, not just because of who I am. Looking at Machiavelli's response to Exile, we can see all 3 patterns. He didn't see his fall as permanent. He found new ways to exercise influence. He didn't let his political disgrace contaminate every aspect of his identity. He reinvented himself as a writer and thinker. And he recognized that his downfall was largely due to political circumstances beyond his control, not a reflection of his personal worth. This brings us to one of Machiavelli's core concepts, virtù. Though often translated simply as virtue in Machiavelli's writing, virtù meant something much more complex than just moral goodness. It referred to a kind of practical effectiveness, the ability to respond to changing circumstances, to adapt, to see opportunities where others see only obstacles, and to act decisively when necessary. One must be a fox to recognize traps, he wrote, and a lion to frighten wolves. In other words, success requires both cleverness and strength, flexibility and firmness, depending on what the situation demands. What's fascinating is how closely Machiavelli's concept of virtù aligns with what modern psychologists like Seligman identify as resilience and psychological flexibility. Both involve seeing reality clearly, even when it's harsh, adapting to changing circumstances rather than clinging to how things should be, and maintaining a sense of agency even when external control is limited. The parallels are striking. Machiavelli developed these ideas through personal experience and observation in the brutal political landscape of Renaissance Italy. Seligman arrived at similar conclusions through careful scientific experimentation centuries later. Different paths, similar destination. So how exactly did Machiavelli apply these principles to overcome his own learned helplessness after exile? His approach offers valuable lessons for anyone facing adversity. First, he created distance between himself and his suffering. Notice how, in his letter, Machiavelli describes taking off his mud-covered farm clothes and putting on his formal attire before entering his study. This wasn't just a change of wardrobe, it was a psychological ritual that helped him step out of his immediate circumstances and connect with something larger. He refused to let his current situation define him completely. When we're drowning in adversity, gaining this kind of psychological distance can be transformative. It might mean physically changing your environment, engaging in a different activity, or simply reminding yourself that this is just one chapter of my story, not the whole book. Second, Machiavelli focused intensely on what he could control, not what he couldn't. He couldn't change Florentine politics or end his exile, but he could control how he spent his evenings, what he read, and what he wrote. By concentrating his energy on these areas of influence, he gradually expanded his impact far beyond what would have seemed possible from his position of exile. This principle appears repeatedly in resilience research. Those who recover best from setbacks tend to quickly identify what aspects of their situation they can influence, however small, and direct their attention there rather than ruminating on all the factors beyond their control. Third, Machiavelli's approach to power itself transformed. Before his fall, his power came from his official position and connections. After exile, he discovered a different kind of power, the power of insight, of seeing through illusions, of understanding how things really work beneath the surface of politics and human relations. "Everyone sees what you appear to be," he wrote. "Few experience what you really are." This recognition that appearances often mask reality became central to his political philosophy, and it started with his own experience of having the trappings of power stripped away, forcing him to identify more fundamental sources of influence. This shift from external to internal sources of power is critical for overcoming learned helplessness. When we base our sense of control entirely on external factors, job titles, wealth, others' approval, we remain vulnerable to collapse when those factors change. Developing internal sources of power, knowledge, skills, character strengths, self-awareness, creates a more resilient foundation. But Machiavelli's greatest triumph over helplessness may have been his ability to find meaning in his suffering. His exile wasn't just something to endure. It became the very condition that enabled his greatest work. Without that forced removal from political life, would he have gained the perspective necessary to write The Prince? Would he have had the time or motivation to develop his revolutionary political insights? As he wrote to Virtù, "I have found men who desire to honor me so much and love me that they say I would do better to leave politics altogether and turn to writing, that if I waited until I was called back to government service, I could wait a long time. But if I wrote something substantial, I would bring myself glory." This ability to derive meaning from suffering, to see how hardship might serve some greater purpose, is what psychologist Viktor Frankl would later identify as one of the most powerful antidotes to despair. Machiavelli didn't just survive his exile. He found a way to make it meaningful, to transform it into the crucible for his greatest contributions. So how can we apply these insights from Machiavelli and Seligman to overcome our own experiences of helplessness and develop a resilient power mindset? Let's look at some practical strategies. First, become aware of your explanatory style, how you habitually explain negative events to yourself. When something goes wrong, do you automatically think it's permanent, pervasive, and entirely your fault? Catching these patterns is the first step to changing them. Seligman found that even brief interventions that help people recognize and challenge pessimistic explanations can significantly reduce feelings of helplessness. For example, if you lose a job, the helpless response might be, "I'll never find work again," permanent. "I'm a complete failure at everything," pervasive. "It's all because I'm fundamentally incompetent," personal. A more resilient response acknowledges reality without catastrophizing. "This is a difficult setback, temporary, though my skills in other areas remain valuable," specific. "And while I made some mistakes, market conditions and company politics also played a role," balanced attribution. Second, develop Machiavellian virtù, not in the commonly misunderstood sense of being unethical, but in terms of adaptability and practical effectiveness. This means seeing reality clearly, without illusions or wishful thinking, adapting your approach based on circumstances rather than rigidly following one method, developing multiple skills and ways of exerting influence, and building a repertoire of responses rather than reacting the same way to every challenge. In today's rapidly changing world, this kind of flexibility is even more valuable than it was in Machiavelli's time. Those who can adapt quickly to new circumstances, technological changes, economic shifts, or personal setbacks, maintain their power and effectiveness where others might fall into helplessness. Third, cultivate psychological distance from immediate circumstances. Machiavelli created this through his evening ritual of changing clothes and entering his study. We might find it through meditation, creative pursuits, physical exercise, or meaningful connections with others. Anything that helps us step back from our immediate problems and see them in a larger context. When Machiavelli lost his external position, he still had his mind, his observations, his understanding of human nature and politics. Those internal resources became his new foundation. Similarly, we can develop resources that aren't easily taken away. Knowledge, skills, character strengths, meaningful relationships, and self-awareness. This doesn't mean ignoring external forms of power and influence, which clearly matter in the real world. But it does mean creating a more balanced portfolio of resources so that your sense of agency doesn't collapse when external circumstances change. Fifth, search for meaning in adversity. This doesn't mean pretending that suffering is good or that injustice is acceptable. Rather, it means asking, given that this difficult thing has happened, how might I use it as an opportunity for growth, learning, or contribution? Machiavelli's Exile became the condition for his greatest work. What might your current challenges make possible? Research consistently shows that people who can find meaning in difficult experiences, not just explaining why something happened, but identifying how it connects to something larger than themselves, recover more effectively from trauma and setbacks. Finally, rebuild reputation strategically after failure. Machiavelli never fully returned to political office, but through his writings, he rebuilt a different kind of reputation that has far outlasted the political figures of his day. When facing reputational damage, the Machiavellian approach isn't to deny reality or make excuses, but to clearly assess the situation and identify the most effective path forward. This might mean demonstrating changed behavior over time, rather than just making promises. Finding new arenas where your strengths can shine, as Machiavelli did with writing. Focusing on building trust with specific key relationships, rather than trying to rehabilitate your image with everyone at once. And being patient, recognizing that reputation, once damaged, takes time to rebuild. What makes the connection between Machiavelli and Seligman so powerful is that it bridges the theoretical and the practical, the historical and the contemporary. Machiavelli developed his insights through lived experience in an intensely competitive political environment. Seligman validated similar principles through rigorous scientific methods. Together, they offer a more complete picture of how humans can overcome helplessness and reclaim their power. The world is full of forces that can make us feel powerless. Economic uncertainty, political turmoil, personal setbacks, and systemic barriers. These realities shouldn't be dismissed or minimized, but neither should they be allowed to convince us that nothing we do matters, that we have no agency, no capacity to influence our circumstances or create meaning from difficulty. As Machiavelli wrote, "Where the willingness is great, the difficulties cannot be great." He didn't choose to be exiled, but he did choose how to respond to exile. And that choice transformed him from a disgraced politician into one of history's most influential thinkers, someone whose ideas about power, politics, and human nature continue to shape our world 5 centuries later. So the next time you face a setback that makes you feel powerless, whether it's losing a job, facing rejection, or encountering obstacles that seem insurmountable, remember Machiavelli in his Exile. Remember that feeling helpless doesn't mean you are helpless. Remember that even in the darkest circumstances, you have choices about how to respond. And those choices, accumulated over time, can lead to forms of power and influence you might not yet be able to imagine. After all, who would have predicted that a disgraced, exiled politician would become one of history's most enduring voices on the nature of power itself? Perhaps your current setback, like Machiavelli's, isn't the end of your story, but rather the beginning of a more powerful chapter. The connection between Machiavelli and Seligman reminds us that human psychology hasn't fundamentally changed across the centuries. The same patterns of thought and behavior that enabled Machiavelli to overcome learned helplessness in Renaissance Italy can work for us today. Whether you're facing career setbacks, relationship challenges, health issues, or any other form of adversity, the principles remain the same. Maintain perspective, focus on what you can control, develop internal sources of power, find meaning in difficulty, and be strategic about rebuilding. What's particularly powerful about this historical psychological connection is how it validates these principles from multiple angles. We're not just relying on modern psychological research, though Seligman's findings are robust and well documented. We're not just drawing lessons from a historical figure, though Machiavelli's story is compelling. We're seeing how these principles of resilience and agency emerge independently in different contexts, suggesting that they tap into something fundamental about human nature and our relationship with adversity. This doesn't mean the path from helplessness to power is easy or straightforward. Machiavelli still suffered in exile. He still faced poverty and isolation. He still yearned to return to political life. Overcoming learned helplessness doesn't mean you won't experience pain or that you'll immediately achieve all your goals. What it means is that you maintain your capacity to act, to influence outcomes, to create meaning, even when circumstances are far from ideal. And that capacity, that sense of agency amid difficulty, may be one of the most important determinants of whether adversity destroys you or transforms you. As Seligman's research has shown, it's not the adversity itself that predicts outcomes like depression, achievement, or health. It's how people interpret and respond to that adversity. The story you tell yourself about what's happening and what it means shapes both your immediate reactions and your long-term trajectory. Machiavelli could have told himself a story of victimhood and finality. My enemies have won, my career is over, my life is ruined. Many would have. Instead, he crafted a different narrative. Though I'm physically exiled, my mind remains free. Though I've lost one form of influence, I can develop another. Though my present is constrained, I can still shape the future. That narrative wasn't just comforting, it was generative. It opened possibilities that the victim narrative would have closed off. In our own lives, we constantly face this same narrative choice. When setbacks occur, do we craft stories of helplessness or stories of possibility? Do we focus on what's been lost or what might still be created? Do we define ourselves by our circumstances or by our responses to them? The answers to these questions don't just reflect our mindset, they help create it. This is where Machiavelli's concept of virtù and Seligman's work on learned optimism truly converge. Both recognize that while we can't control everything that happens to us, we maintain significant power over how we interpret and respond to events. And that interpretive power, the ability to see clearly, adapt flexibly, and act effectively even in difficult circumstances, is ultimately what determines whether we succumb to helplessness or develop increasing resilience. That's the lasting legacy of both Machiavelli and Seligman. The recognition that power isn't just something conferred by external position or circumstance. True power includes the capacity to remain the author of your own story, even when that story takes unexpected and challenging turns. It's the ability to find opportunity in difficulty, to create meaning in suffering, and to maintain agency in circumstances that tempt you toward helplessness. In the end, perhaps that's the most Machiavellian insight of all. That power doesn't just exist in the world of politics and position, but in the human capacity to overcome circumstance through perspective, adaptation, and determined action. 500 years before psychologists documented the dynamics of learned helplessness and learned optimism, Machiavelli was living these principles, transforming exile into opportunity, disgrace into legacy, and limitation into a different kind of freedom. His example, illuminated by Seligman's research, offers us not just historical interest, but practical wisdom for navigating our own challenging circumstances. We may not all write world-changing books during our periods of adversity, but we can all cultivate the mindset that makes meaningful response possible. And in doing so, we reclaim power in the most fundamental sense, not the power to control everything that happens to us, but the power to shape what it means and what happens next.